Good evening and welcome to the Tenement Museum. My name is Annie Polland. I'm the museum's president, and it's a huge honor to be here in the Joseph and Bridget Moore family apartment set to 1869. Every day we tell the story of Joseph and Bridget Moore, Irish immigrants who raised their children here at 97 Orchard. And I know this month, March, is Irish American Heritage Month, which is wonderful. But I think what I love most about the Tenement Museum is that we tell the stories of Irish, Italian, Jewish, Black, Puerto Rican, Chinese, all sorts of different American stories here under one roof. And so while the month gives us the opportunity to celebrate, don't worry, you can come back any day and hear these wonderful histories and read more about them from the books in our shop that are also available, I think, in the chat. So I want to start out just by thanking the public programs, the people who make the public programs possible, which are the National Park Service, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the New York State Council of the Arts, and Humanities New York. And most important, all those institutions are important, but most important are our members who help support the work we do. I cannot say how important right now the support of individuals are for museums and nonprofits, so thank you for supporting our work. Tonight, we're going to delve into the background of the Irish American experience that Joseph and Bridget encountered through a conversation between two wonderful scholars about what Irish American life was like in the mid-19th century. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. Hidetaka Hirota is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley, where he teaches U.S. immigration history and co-directs the Canadian Studies program, which is really exciting right now. He is the author of Expelling the Poor, Atlantic Seaboard States and the 19th Century Origins of American Immigration Policy, which received multiple distinctions, including the first book award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society, the Lois P. Rudnick Book Award from the New England American Studies Association, and the Donald Murphy Prize from the American Conference for Irish Studies. He is currently vice president and president-elect of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Kevin Kenny is Glucksman Professor of History at New York University and author, most recently, of The Problem of Immigration in a Slaveholding Republic States, out with Oxford University Press. This book won the James A. Rowley Prize and the Theodore Salutis Award. He is past president of the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. And I think one of the things I love the most at the Tenement Museum, we tell the stories of families like the Moores, but we also try to think of the scholars who we work with as a family, as a community at the Tenement Museum. And Kevin Kenny was the advisor to Hide when he was writing his dissertation at NYU. So we have many, many different family connections. So they will be engaged in conversation for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll be able to open it up for questions from you, our virtual audience. So just go ahead, type your questions in the chat, and we're excited to hear from you. So welcome to the Tenement Museum.
Thank you, Annie, and thanks everybody for organising this event. Hide, a few years ago you published a remarkable book, Expelling the Poor. Little did you know, I think, how relevant that book would continue to be and how timely it is today. And what we're going to do, I think, this evening is start with the Irish, because this is a book about the 19th century in which you have discovered some very important things: the impact of nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment, also the origins of immigration policy today. But we'll get back to today a little later. Let's go back to the 19th century, maybe even a little earlier, and let's just start by talking a little bit about the Irish. Why did so many Irish people come here to the United States?
Right, well, thank you. Thanks for the question, and thank you to Annie and supporters of Tenement Museum. So why did a large number of Irish people come to the United States? The direct cause, I guess, is the British colonialism over Ireland, that was firmly established by the early 19th century. And to keep the story really short, British colonialism, caused the impoverishment of the Irish population, and that was the kind of precondition for my story of Irish immigration. On top of the general impoverishment of the Irish population, there was the so-called Great Potato Famine. Right? The potato disease, hit Europe widely, but Ireland was hit particularly hard, and Irish people were already impoverished under British colonialism, and one of the consequences of that was dependence on the potato as the major source of nutrition, and then this nutrition supply was disrupted as the potato crop died. So the life became extremely severe in Ireland, and it was increasingly a choice between slow death, starvation at home, or fleeing the country for possibly better fortunes, right? So that's the context of the so-called Irish, diaspora exodus in the 19th century, and the United States was the major destination for the Irish migrants.
So let's step back a little bit and just consider the scale of what's happening here, because it's really extraordinary. About 10 million people left that small island since 1700. About 7 million people live on that island today. Right. We know that the Irish were coming long before the famine. They were coming in the colonial period in the 18th century. We know that there were a lot of Irish here in New York City in the first half of the 19th century. And then something awful happened. Mm-hmm. And let's talk about the famine a little bit. Firstly, its impact in Ireland, mm-hmm. and then its impact in America. Population of Ireland reached its all-time historical peak in 1845 at 8.5 million people. Right. It's never got back there since. Mm-hmm. It was down to 4 million by the end of the 19th century. It's creeping up, but it's still only 7 million. Right. It's lower than it was on the eve of the famine. The population of the island was reduced by 1/3 in 10 years. Right. At least 1 million died, at least 2 million emigrated, most of them here to North America, and some of them, the majority, of course, to New York City. How did that happen? How and why did something of that kind happen in Ireland before we even look at the Irish over here?
So, yes, as I said, the Irish people were already, impoverished, right? And then when the potato disease hit Ireland, essentially the British government, which was supposed to take care of the Irish population, didn't handle the situation well for a variety of reasons. There's much debate over among scholars and to what extent the British government was responsible for the famine and the death and emigration. But the fact was that the British government didn't provide enough support to suffering Irish people, and a lot of Irish were also deported, from Ireland to Britain. The opposite way, from Britain to Ireland under the British policy. Irish people were emigrating to North America during the 30s, right? Increasingly, especially Catholics. But I would say, the mismanagement of the situation, Irish situation by the British government, was one of the key factors for a large number of Irish people to leave the country, and also the mismanagement of the British by the British government was also responsible for the massive death of the Irish population.
So the immigrants came here with memories of the famine, and the famine, I think, became foundational to their sense of who they were. So over the course of a single decade, starting in 1845, 2 million people leave the island. That's out of a population of just over 8 million. Most of them come to North America, and most of those who come to North America come here. So we're here in the Bridget and Joseph Moore Irish apartment at the Tenement Museum. If you were in New York City in 1850 or 1860, 1 in 4 people in the city was Irish born.
Right.
And that had a huge impact. Native-born Americans looked around, and they didn't always like what they saw.
You know, that's a very important question. You know, for many, you know, native-born Americans who were Protestant at that time, you know, Irish immigrants were at that time, you know, really cultural, religious, ethnic others, right? You know, by this point, Catholics became the majority of the Irish migrants, and you know, in the first place, yes, you know, the religion is really different between native-born Protestant Americans and Catholic Irish migrants, and this was translated into hostility. Essentially, it's a religious nativism. You know, nativism is the immigrant sentiment, intense hostility toward you know, foreigners. So, you know, a lot of native-born Americans developed anti-Irish sentiment because of the religious difference. But at the same time, again, already by the 1930s, you know, Irish people became poorer. I mean, migrants to the United States were essentially poor, but even among the migrants, you know, Irish were poorer than the average. And then famine migrants were significantly even poorer than that. So besides, you know, religion, for a lot of native-born Americans, you know, Irish people were sort of, you know, appearing as threats to public health, for example, and the poor as well. So, you know, hostility based on material conditions, economic status, conditions of the Irish also emerged, and those hostilities were really directed against the Irish migrants.
So I listened to both of us quoting our graduate school preparation exams in our definition of nativism, right? We're talking about nativism, and we're both actually quoting almost verbatim a famous definition of nativism by John Hyam a long time ago, but it's still a very influential book. Nativism as intense hostility to an internal population based on its foreign or un-American connections. I mean, talk about a timely definition, and that was written 70 years ago. There are various strands to this. There's a religious strand, and the sense that Catholicism per se is somehow un-American in the 19th century. And, you know, that's a live question until 1960, I think, when John F. Kennedy explains that he is not the Catholic candidate for president, he's the Democratic candidate who happens to be a Catholic. Exactly. So we've got the religious strain. There's a political dimension, which we might talk about, and then there's the question of poverty, because your book is called Expelling the Poor. Let's talk about both of those things. Let's talk about the political dimension of nativism, because something, again, very unusual happens in the 1850s. There's a political crisis in the United States, and nativism, which you could say is omnipresent, suddenly assumes a political dimension. Let's talk about that, and then let's get to the heart of the matter, which is, I think, poverty.
So, yeah, politically, you know, a lot of Irish immigrants, once they were in the United States, especially the Northeast, became supporters of the Democratic Party at the time. And, you know, Democratic Party was, at the time, was essentially advocating, you know, white supremacy and also sort of sympathetic to anti-abolitionism. And Irish immigrants themselves, you know, became increasingly critical of the, you know, anti-slavery movement and abolitionism. So the politically, you know, especially, you know, in the North, you know, when, you know, there was growing anti-slavery sentiment. Again, anti-slavery sentiment, as we know, is never a kind of dominant, not necessarily dominant thinking, but it's increasingly influential, right? And in this situation, when if Irish migrants, endorse or criticize abolitionism or anti-slavery movement, that really upset many of the Northerners, middle-class, Protestant, reform-oriented Americans, native-born Americans. So, Irish migrants, political sort of inclination toward the Democratic Party added fuel, I would say, to the anti-Irish sentiment. Again, that's a political dimension of nativism, right?
So you could look at this and you could say that the Irish weren't especially welcome in the United States when they arrived, especially in the 1840s and 1850s. Two national institutions welcomed them and opened their doors to them, the Catholic Church and the Democratic Party. And you could almost then say the Irish entered those institutions and took them over. Right? They took over the Catholic Church. At a local municipal level, they gained political power through the democratic machines. At the same time, the Irish tended to stand on the wrong side of a number of progressive causes. You've mentioned abolitionism and anti-slavery, temperance, the public school movement, one of the crowning achievements of American Republican democracy, but the Irish want their own schools, right? So there's going to be tension, there's going to be conflict, but ultimately nativism is about scapegoating. There may be a problem in society and you will deflect blame and responsibility for that problem, in this case onto immigrants. It's a recurring theme. There's a political crisis in the United States in the 1850s, but it's over slavery. Enter the Know Nothings in what form?
The Know Nothing Party, it's an interesting thing to consider, and especially that's the case in Massachusetts, right? Know Nothing Party in general emerged as an anti-slavery party. It was in the first place. It is it's a anti-foreign, anti-Catholic political party, right? And the origins of the party were more like a secret societies, like nativist, xenophobistic, secret societies. But during the 1850s, they merged right beyond the surface to become an independent political party. And this party, Know Nothing Party or American Party, its formal name, have two interesting things. One is in the North. One is anti-slavery. It presented itself as an anti-slavery party, and then that became a kind of source of the popularity in northern states, especially in Massachusetts, where anti-slavery sentiment was very strong. And then nativist American Party was also nativist. In Massachusetts, in particular, in Massachusetts, a lot of Bostonians were of Anglo descent and Protestant, and they had nativist sentiment or cultural prejudice against the Irish. So in Massachusetts in particular, there was a kind of interesting convergence of anti-slavery and nativism within the Know Nothing Party. And the result was that, in the elections of 1854, the Know Nothing Party really dominated the state politics, municipal and state politics in Massachusetts. It wasn't that, in New York, it wasn't as strong as it was in Massachusetts, but still, Know Nothing Party, its ascendancy, its rise really, I think, politically, reinforced anti-Irish sentiment.
Yeah, so now I think we're getting to the heart of the matter, right? and to the real important contribution of your book. You touched on how anti-slavery and nativism could coexist.
Right.
Opposition to slavery, opposition to immigrants of a certain kind. There's a labor question here. And you could say that from a certain perspective, a compelling perspective, that the enslavement of human beings is the opposite, the antithesis of a certain model of free labor. But the Irish too embody an antithesis to that model of free labor. They don't appear to be free, independent, upwardly mobile.
Right.
They appear to suggest the entrenchment of poverty and class as a permanent feature of American society. And so all of this comes together in an ideological ferment that could be, if you like, progressive and regressive. It could be opposed to slavery. It could also be opposed to poor immigrants.
Right.
Your book is expelling the poor.
Yeah. So so a lot of the Irish ended up entering public charitable institutions in northern states. For a variety of reasons, they were not able to support themselves, and the Murrow family here. Immigrants like them could, potentially at any time could enter, public charitable institutions. Let's say husband suddenly died, or husband disappeared, or they lost jobs, or for a variety of reasons, people could become public charges. But in the 19th century, in the 19th century, becoming a public charge or becoming a pauper, that's a term used at the time. Becoming a pauper meant losing independence, right? You entered public charitable institutions, and then they will be supported by somebody else. So you're not going to be an independent person, and if this happened to like white people, they were considered failed people in 19th century American society, especially Northern society, because in the North, people thought that technically upward mobility is guaranteed, unlike the slave South. Under slavery, no such mobility would be possible. But in the North, technically, without slavery, you're supposed to be able to climb up the social ladder, economic ladder. But then, why do you fail? And then when this kind of sentiment was supplemented by the existing anti-Irish prejudice, like Irish people were lazy or not hardworking enough, then there's a strong sentiment against the poor Irish, right? Just like unfree Irish as an unfree people, if you entered public charitable institutions, this sentiment really triggered immigration policies for the introduction of immigration policies for impoverished immigrants, especially the Irish. Hence the expelling the poor, which is the title of my book.
Mm-hmm. So put these two groups, enslaved people in the South, undesirable immigrants, poor Irish immigrants, especially in the North, both embodying somehow the antithesis of a free labor ideal. Put that in the context of a political crisis over slavery and the breakdown of the two-party political system, and then you have a scenario for nativism as scapegoating. You need to blame somebody for what's going on. What's really important about your book is you move beyond nativism simply as bigotry or prejudice, a body of ugly ideas, which might tell us more about the mind of the nativist than the lives of immigrants. You move beyond that to look at the practical impact.
Right.
So that really the starting question for your book, as I recall it, is, okay, we have nativism as cultural bigotry, as prejudice, but how did that translate into law and policy? That I think is very much the heart of your book, Expelling the Poor.
Yeah, so that is the question we both had years ago when I was a graduate student. So we study. I mean, there's much study on the ideological and cultural dimensions of anti-Irish sentiment. So let's say in New York and Boston, Irish were criticized for being Catholics. Irish were criticized for being, for allegedly drinking too much or being violent, or those cultural prejudices are, studied, right, by many historian scholars. But then we had this question, right, whether or not this hostility, like a social level cultural prejudice, was translated into any public policy, actual legal consequences. Did the Irish anti-Irish sentiment, did anti-Irish nativism have any practical impact at the level of law and policy? That was the question that I had.
That was the question, and then to answer that question, the first realization, well, the next question, if you like, was who controlled immigration policy?
Yeah. So at the time, local and state governments were administering immigration. Today, we almost take it for granted that the federal government, the U.S. national government, regulates immigration, but that was not the case. Back in the 19th century, especially before the 1870s, right? Since the foundation to the mid-19th century, it's the local and state governments that administered immigration. So my book really discusses how the states of New York and Massachusetts, those governments, state governments, responded to Irish immigration by creating legal mechanisms, like policies for regulating immigration.
Okay, so to make this really tangible, what would people like Joseph and Bridget Moore have had to do to enter the United States?
Yeah, so
compared to, especially we have some sense of what
Right.
that might involve today with visas and passports, but what was it like then?
So yeah, when in the 19th century, when an immigrant arrived in New York or Boston, state officials, state immigration officials got on board the ship, and those officers examined the conditions of the passengers, right? And if officials found immigrants who appeared likely to become public charges, meaning that if the immigrant appeared not being able to support themselves, the ship masters, the masters of the ship that carry those passengers were required to post bonds, in case the poor immigrants actually entered public institutions, public charitable institutions, and became paupers. So it's a kind of prepayment system, right?
Yeah, tell us more. What does that mean to post a bond for an immigrant in those days? Who posted the bond? The ship captain?
Ship captains.
Yeah.
Ship captains were required to post bonds. A certain amount of money, and the bonds, will be used if immigrants actually became paupers, or they entered public institutions, being public charges. And if shipmasters refuse to post bonds, say, I'm not going to post any bond for the landing of this passenger, then those destitute passengers were not allowed to land. So it's a form of landing regulation. It's a form of immigration control. It's a really early form of border control, if I use today's word. Destitute passengers were not allowed to enter unless the ship captain posts particular special bonds for their landing. So the state governments really wanted to make sure that states would have the money to support those immigrants, destitute immigrants, in case they did indeed become public charges.
All right, and again, just at a practical level, let's jump ahead a little bit to more familiar territory, the 20th century, which is a little more familiar. We know that immigrants who come today need passports.
Mm-hmm.
We know that there's what's called a consular visa system.
Right.
You start that process abroad. Just sketch that out for us and tell us how different, to get back to the 19th century, how different was it in the middle of the 19th century?
Yeah, well, in the first place, there was no a visa system, right? Yeah. It was invented, in the early 20th century. But before that, there was basically no sort of departure control back in in the home country. Immigrants would come to the United States, and then upon arrival they went through landing inspection. So I think that's a major difference, right? And I think later this practice, which is examination upon arrival, was inherited by places like Ellis Island, like federal landing institution in the late 19th century. And in the case of Massachusetts, it had one more policy, which is post-entry deportation. New York didn't have this policy, but its neighboring states, Massachusetts developed systems that expelled those already in the United States from the United States.
Okay, I definitely want to talk about that theme of deportation and what's particular to Massachusetts. Just to stay on this practical question of what it's like to arrive and who's controlling the process. So each state, and not just each state, but you could say each local jurisdiction, towns and cities have their own policies, right? On admitting or excluding people, and there are a small number of us who work on this, right? On way back in ancient history in the 19th century, as I call it, right? It was different then. The supposition would be that America closed its borders in the fundamental sense in the 1920s, right? And immigration restriction in the 1920s is on a whole new order, qualitative and quantitative, right? We know that, but I think it would be a wrong inference then to say that borders were
closed,
were simply wide open before that, right?
Before that, right?
I think that would be wrong. But again, I'd want to correct that, and I would disagree with some colleagues in saying, okay, the borders were not wide open,
right?
But that doesn't mean they were closed in the 20th or 21st century either.
Right.
So this is something worth going into in some detail. So immigrants who came from Ireland in this case, who were visibly poor, the ship captain would post a bond, which would need to be redeemed if they entered an almshouse, or he could pay a commutation fee, a tax, right? My sense is that those expenses were then added to the fare, and the fares went up, and so businesses, shipping companies had a stake in this. But here's always my question. It might be one that we'll disagree on. Were these measures at the state level and the municipal level, were these fiscal measures or were they exclusionary measures? In other words, were they designed to raise revenue for the upkeep of the poor, or were they exclusionary measures in the sense we might understand that today, whereby large numbers of people were being prevented from entering the country?
I think it's both. I would say primary function is, as you say, it's an upkeep of immigrants. I think the state governments are most concerned about the cost of supporting destitute immigrants at public charitable institutions. They say New York City Alms House, right? It's a public institution. So the state officials were what they wanted to achieve most is to make sure that public money would not suffer from supporting the destitute immigrants. So a bonding system is it's a fiscal measure in this sense, but at the same time it's a system of deterrence. I wouldn't call it as a strict landing prohibition, because that was not. The thing is that the vast majority of Irish immigrants were admitted in the end. But the state officials did say that it's hopefully we could discourage ship masters from landing most expensive immigrants. And so in that sense, it's a deterrence, and it is in this sense that I said it's an early form, not exactly the same form as today's border control. It's an early form of border control.
Yeah, and I think that term deterrence is very important, because it's not either or fiscal or exclusionary. There's that element of deterrence. Another domain in which bonding was used to control human mobility in this period, of course, was the movement of free black people across state lines, and classically into the old Northwest, today's Midwest. There was a bonding requirement, so two guarantors had to in fact put up money in case the migrating black person became a public charge. these laws weren't always enforced rigorously,
Right.
but the mere fact that they're on the books is a deterrent, and it enforces a stigma. In fact, interestingly, I've never seen this parallel pursued, but it reminds me a little bit of the penal laws in colonial Ireland. You mentioned British colonialism earlier. Restrictions that weren't always enforced on what Catholic people could do, but the mere fact of having those restrictions on the books is a very powerful thing. The other thing about this is, so there's no national immigration policy run by the federal government, in effect, until the 1870s and 1880s. We've each written books about this from different angles. So if you were to look for, if you were to ask the question, what is U.S. immigration policy before the Civil War? Well, it's a collection of laws at state and local level, and insofar as they affect foreigners as well as free black people, then that's the immigration policies of the United States, right? Which means they vary from place to place. In South Carolina, if you were a free black sailor arriving from another state or from the Caribbean or from England, you could be imprisoned, put in jail for the duration of your stay. In New York, there are the bonding and taxation rules we've talked about. Massachusetts then is a special case, and let's get back to that question of deportation, because it's more extreme in Massachusetts, the anti-Irish sentiment, than elsewhere.
I think, so Massachusetts is really unique in the history of 19th century state-level immigration policy, precisely because, as you said, it's uniquely developed practice of post-entry deportation, not just any landing deterrence or discouragement, right? Only in Massachusetts, immigrants could be expelled even after their admission or even settlement, in the United States. And so it's a legacy of the colonial pro law, which again allowed local governments to expel indigent people to be returned to where they belong. So the law said, in Massachusetts, immigrants could be sent beyond the sea where he belongs. That's the word. Right.
Do you have a sense of scale?
It's very difficult to determine. So first of all, immigrants in Massachusetts, destitute foreigners could be sent to various places. Right. So obviously, Europe, like England and Ireland, were some of the destinations. But at the same time, question is again where the immigrant belonged. That this question really determines sort of destination. So let's say somebody from Ireland landed in Canada first, and then came down to the United States, and then became a pauper. Entered a public institution. In this sense, sometimes an officer thought that. So the Canada was where he belongs. So therefore, he should be sent back to Canada. Or let's say somebody landed in New York first and then moved to Boston and became poor, impoverished. And New York could be considered, right? The place or the locality where the person belonged. So state officials sent migrants to really different, destinations. And we don't really have complete statistics. This said, my sense is that overseas removal was rarer, more rare than domestic deportation, because sending somebody to Ireland will be much more expensive, right? To sending somebody to Europe, and then what we know is that at least between the 1830s and 1880s, when the federal government started regulating immigration, about 50,000 people were removed from Massachusetts. I'm not saying 50,000 were deported back to Ireland, right? But that's the number of individuals removed from the state.
Out of state.
Yes.
Yeah, but some of them were, and so your book has a hard analytical edge in that it looks at nativism translated into policy. It also has a very moving dimension to it for the reader, because you're able to trace some of these individuals
Right.
who came from Ireland or England to Massachusetts or New York, let's say Massachusetts, and then were sent back. And you're actually able to trace some of them. I may be putting you on the spot, but do you have a story of an individual in your head? Or
Yeah, not many, but
Yeah.
I was able to track down what happened to those Irish migrants who were deported, right? I have to start, quickly by describing what law enforcement, like a deportation enforcement, was like during the Know Nothing period in 1850s. It's the period characterized by radical nativism. This hostility was translated into very extreme enforcement of the deportation law. Some of the deportees included, native-born children of Irish migrants or, naturalized Irish immigrants. And I also found out that some of the deportees were in their 70s. And then some of them had spent like 4 decades in the United States before they were finally sent back to Ireland.
What happened to them when they
what
went back?
happened,
Yeah.
essentially, they were marginalized, whether, so many of them were first sent to Liverpool rather than Ireland, just because, Liverpool was a major port, and it's easier for officials to send them, right, to Liverpool. But once in Liverpool, Britain already had, its own deportation policy, which developed during the famine. So a lot of the Irish who were deported to Liverpool were further deported down to Ireland under the British deportation policy. So they were doubly deported in this sense. First from from Boston to Liverpool under Massachusetts, like American law, and then in Liverpool this time under British law, British deportation law to Ireland.
Where they receive a warm welcome, no doubt.
That's a question, and unfortunately, sadly, many of the Irish who were finally sent back to Ireland found themselves subject to kind of similar hostility in Ireland, because many of the Irish, communities, counties, county officials, plural officials, considered the Irish, the migrants, no longer belonging to their communities. So there was strong hostility to the acceptance of those returned migrants, right? So one of the things that my book tries to illuminate is how the migrants became eventually, in practice, kind of stateless, whether in Ireland, whether in U.S., Britain, or Canada, or Ireland. They were kind of marginalized, and then they were seen as kind of outsiders to the communities.
And your ability to do this at an individual level adds a really poignant dimension to the book for the reader. So how did we then move, or did we move, from state to federal? What I mean by that is, of course, it's a national regime of immigration control that emerges from the 1870s onwards. Not by coincidence, I argue in my own work, that it should emerge in conjunction with the abolition of slavery. It's another story. But what I'm trying to get at here is the continuity. So it's national, sure, rather than local. But there's real continuity, both in design and content and in actual implementation. So you have the prize-winning article called "The Moment of Transition." I advised you not to pursue it, and you did. So never listen to your advisor. So the moment of transition. Tell us about the moment of transition from local to federal.
Of course. I want to start by saying that, the state immigration policy was never kind of based on definite authority, right? There's always question about the state government's constitutional right or power to do that. There's always concern that state policies violate or infringed on federal power, especially federal power over foreign commerce. The federal government had the right to engage with control of foreign commerce. That's what the Constitution said. But in 1870s, there was a major, a few actually major landmark decisions by U.S. Supreme Court, which declared state passenger laws unconstitutional for violating national government's, federal government's power over foreign commerce. And as a result, state government's passenger policies essentially, died, whether it's New York, Massachusetts, California. And
which leaves the question: who's going to pay for the upkeep of,
exactly.
of the foreign poor?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So state officials, especially Massachusetts and New York, they were at a loss what to do. Now they can't, secure money to support for the support of the migrant poor. So that's the moment, again, 70s, 1870. That's when state immigration officials, especially those in New York and Massachusetts, started the campaign to establish national immigration legislation. And the campaign resulted in the federal law called the Immigration Act of 1882. The other immigration law of 1882 is probably more famous, right? Which is the Chinese Restriction Act of 1882, which banned the admission of Chinese laborers for 10 years. But there's another important piece of legislation that is the focus of my work, which is again Immigration Act of 1882. That's the first national legislation that regulated general immigration. In this case, immigration of foreigners other than Chinese, who were covered by Chinese exclusion laws. This law, prohibited the landing of the poor, the people with mental illness, and criminals. And this law was consciously, intentionally modeled on existing New York and Massachusetts state immigration law,
and even designed and implemented by local officials
exactly.
in New York and Massachusetts.
Yeah. As of 1880s, the federal government did not have the force to implement the law. So even though it was a federal law, the provisions, again, the examination and exclusion, those provisions were implemented by state immigration officials like in New York, commissioners of immigration, for example.
Then it includes a 50-cent head tax, which is borrowed from the earlier state laws, and the categories of likely to be.
So that's the ultimate significance of early state immigration laws. Yeah. So I'm not saying that, as you say, the borders were closed even before the early 19th century. Borders were not entirely closed, and the fact was that most immigrants were admitted, but there's a clear legal and institutional continuity from the state level policy to federal policy. And I think that's the most important sort of, the significance of anti-Irish sentiment. In this sense, I think anti-Irish sentiment kind of laid some of the important foundations for later federal laws.
I have lots more questions, but I'm also hoping that people in our audience this evening have questions too. So we'll roll the dice on that one and see.
So thank you for this really sophisticated and nuanced conversation. And I hate to disrupt the sophistication and the nuance of the conversation, but one of the things from the public we hear sometimes is immigrants back then were legal, and today it's not legal or it's illegal calling. And so how does your conversation, given your conversation, what are the big takeaways, and how would you respond to a kind of blunt but very prevalent kind of question and distinction?
So that's a question that we always receive, right? But again, one thing that we really need to understand is that despite my work, again, the fact was that the vast majority of immigrants were admitted, and laws were much more lenient. Immigration laws, even state immigration laws, were much more lenient toward migrants than today's immigration law. So there's a fundamental difference between legal admission at the time and legal admission today. if you just come, I mean, back in the 19th century, essentially, even in the late 19th century, if you come with like $30 in cash, then you'll be okay. You can enter, and especially at Ellis Island or in New York, the premise of immigration policy is admission, right? Whereas today, in order to enter the country, you have to clear layers of admission processes, and the expectations are fundamentally different. So that's the first response. And at the same time, I want to add that, in the 19th century or late 19th century, early 20th century, immigration officials were not really willing to exclude immigrants in the first place. So a lot of immigrants entered, unlawfully, the United States. So there's a question actually. Most people enter the country legally, and that's not entirely accurate actually. It was much easier to enter the country without going through inspection or so that's yeah.
Well, you can only act illegally if there are laws passed that you can break. And those laws came later.
Yeah.
And it's not a crime under international law to seek asylum in another country.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk tonight. We've had visitors chime in from all over the country. We've had Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York, Michigan, Virginia, Florida, Maine, Massachusetts, D.C., and I think our furthest watcher is from Berlin, Germany. And I'm just going to ask a few questions that have sort of been coming up in the chat. You were talking a little bit about how sort of the implementation of things like visas today and so on. There's a question in the chat, sort of when does the requiring of a sponsor become a requirement? Did different states require sponsors that other states didn't prior to sort of the federal government taking over immigration law?
The whole idea of sponsorship there exists at the state level. It's a 20th century sort of policy, and again, the consular interview was introduced only in the early 20th century, and the sponsoring thing was new, and in fact. Up to the early 20th century, receiving sponsorship actually would make you excludable, and this may sound interesting, right? If you received money from third party, you'll be considered what was called assisted immigrants, and the Immigration Act of 1891 prohibited the admission of assisted immigrants. It was part of a kind of labor measure. A lot of capitalists imported immigrants as strike breakers, and so the organized labor unions, wanted to prohibit their landing. So, if you have sponsorship, you couldn't enter the country. In today's sense, sponsorship in today's sense is a much later invention.
Well, there's a nice catch-22 there, because if you're perceived as likely to become public charge, you could be excluded.
Exactly.
If you were assisted, or if you had signed a labour contract abroad, you could be excluded. So some people would say that here's a system that trains immigrants on how to be less truthful.
Yeah, exactly. It was intentionally used in that way. If you say, "Oh, I have no job here," you'll be excluded. And then if you say, "I have labor contract already, I have a sponsorship," you will be excluded as well.
A fascinating answer, I think. It's blowing my mind. You talked a little bit about how different states had different laws, and there was a question coming in about how Philadelphia was a large port, and did they have sort of any different admission requirements? And I'm going to append my own little question to that. Did immigrants try to go to one city over another, depending on hearing about, like, Massachusetts might be a little bit harder, let me go to New York, and let me try Philly, or a smaller city, perhaps?
That is an excellent question, and it looks like that was the case. So Massachusetts had the most strict bonding policy, and also landing inspection policy as well. So a lot of people try to avoid Boston. Again, I don't know how many exactly, but the Boston officials were observing that they reported that our state is deflecting the immigration to New York or New Jersey because thanks to our strict policy. So deterrence, as I discussed earlier, kind of worked, right? As state officials kind of hoped. Philadelphia, New Jersey. Pennsylvania, New Jersey were probably they had milder immigration policies than New York and Massachusetts, and institutionally, New York and Massachusetts had the state immigration officials, like agencies, whereas no such state agency developed in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts on that one. Firstly, there's a question of scale. Boston is known as the most Irish of American cities. That's because the percentage of the population in Boston of Irish extraction is higher. The numbers are higher in Philadelphia. They're higher still in New York. So Philadelphia is a major receiving centre of Irish immigrants, even if the percentage of the overall population that is Irish is lower there than in Boston. So it's very Irish in that sense. The other thing is that these laws and changing the laws have tangible and indeed fatal results. So in 1847, it's referred to as Black 47 in the Irish famine. And it's not because, there's a terrible irony. The potato blight didn't strike. So the famine is all about the potato blight, which strikes in successive years. It didn't strike especially hard in 1847, but not enough crops had been planted the previous year. But the real tragedy takes place in Canada. And migration is deflected from New York to Canada because of an increase in taxes on arriving here in this city. It's deflected to Canada, and tens of thousands of people die in a quarantine facility called Grosse Ile, just north of Montreal under those circumstances. So you can really dig deep into the tangible, concrete consequences of lawmaking in that way.
You mentioned sort of at the beginning talking about the bond that captains had to pay for all sort of the immigrants that were coming over on their ship. What happened if they said, no, I'm not going to pay this?
Yeah, so technically in that case, immigrants were not allowed to land. Again, immigrants appearing likely to become public charges, for them, the landing was really contingent on the payment and posting of bonds by the shipmasters. So, it's not like I'm not talking about the exclusion of like hundreds of people at the same time. More like individual, like say 7 people or something on a single ship. So if you look at newspapers in mid-19th century, like Boston, New York, you see those cases, like the ship captain, somebody refused to pay post bonds for some of his passengers, and as a result, they were not allowed to land, and they were. Most likely they will be returned to the other side of the ocean, the places of origin.
So mostly, as I understand it, they did land, right? And so a bond would be posted, say, for $300. That would fall due in the future if the impoverished immigrant became a public charge. But you can rest assured that a little bond market emerged, because there's always... in immigration, there are always people making money off immigration. On the docks in Liverpool, there are the runners, and the boarding houses, the same here in New York when people arrive. So in the bond market, somebody else might post bond. So the ship captain would pay a local bonding agency to take on that responsibility. And if the bond fell due, the migrant could be placed in effect in a private poorhouse, a private workhouse or almshouse. And there are descriptions of that from the 19th century, which are, if you like pure Dickensian in the awfulness of what it was like to be placed in one of those institutions. So there are always the like the parasites and the dust mites of the immigrant trade, including really unscrupulous bonding agencies here in New York City who would step into the gap.
So this, I mean, the last point is actually important. We didn't have much, we didn't discuss much about, New York's response to immigration, but Castle Garden, for example, that's the New York's landing station, right? I mean, run by the state government of New York, and at that time, New York government was very serious about the protection of immigrants from various kind of vices. So at Castle Garden, immigrants were examined, and then some of them were excluded. But the primary function of that institution was actually protection, of immigrants, from like runners, the so-called runners who try to trick people.
Usually Irish and Irish. And
yeah,
German
exactly,
German,
the same
right?
countryman, right?
Beautiful.
And I always, emphasize this point. In the 19th century, the public officials, public governments were much more serious about the protection of immigrants, whereas such mindset tends to be absent in 20th century, 21st century. But that's some of the lessons that I think that's some of the lessons that we can learn actually, to see how state governments, public officials were really concerned about the welfare of immigrants and their protection from inhumane treatments. New York government thought that the private hospitals and charitable institutions were bad, and then to prevent such inhumane approach treatment of migrants, the state government moved and then established Castle Garden. I mean changed some of parts of Castle Garden into landing station.
Thank you so much for answering all of our questions. We are just about time. So I'm going to thank you again for coming tonight, and for everyone joining us on YouTube watching this live stream.
Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations, Hide, on a wonderful book.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie.